The Galactic Defense Academy, located on the remote planet Vortalis 7, was alive with the buzz of activity as the latest group of recruits arrived from across the galaxy. The grand facility, with its gleaming silver towers and floating holographic banners, stood as a symbol of unity among the diverse alien civilizations that had united in the pursuit of interstellar peace and security. Amid the crowd of new recruits were beings of all shapes and sizes, from towering insectoid creatures clicking their mandibles in nervous anticipation to amphibian-like recruits from aquatic planets awkwardly adjusting to dry land for the first time. Stoic humanoid soldiers stood with military precision, carefully straightening their uniforms. Among them was Captain Albert Hicks, a human officer from Earth. Despite his relatively compact frame, standing just shy of 6 feet tall, there was an air of quiet confidence about him, something that hinted at experience. Albert moved through the crowd with a calm and steady demeanor, carrying a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His dark blue uniform, representative of the United Nations Space Force, fit him perfectly, emphasizing a disciplined bearing that set him apart from the more nervous recruits. Not far from him, a group of Titanian warriors, a species known for their immense size and physical power, stood gathered in a circle, their deep voices resonating through the courtyard. One of them, Crater, a towering figure with skin resembling stone, let out a loud scoff, his voice booming across the area. "Humans," he muttered in an almost mocking tone, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "They can barely survive a day here, let alone in real combat." Crater's presence was overwhelming. His muscular build and sculpted features made him resemble a living statue, and his deep voice commanded attention wherever he went. He eyed Albert, his gaze filled with both amusement and disdain, as though the very thought of a human sharing the same training grounds was laughable. Albert stopped walking for a brief moment, his gaze turning toward Crater. He did not respond, nor did he acknowledge the insult. The brief silence was enough for Crater's companions to laugh, exchanging smirks and nudges among themselves. Unbothered, Albert continued his path to the registration desk, where a series of floating holographic screens hovered above a sleek metallic counter. Behind the desk, an insectoid officer with 6 dexterous arms processed the recruits with swift efficiency, handing out orientation packets and assigning rooms. As Albert waited in line, the sounds of conversation filled the air. Recruits discussed their home planets, boasted about past accomplishments, and speculated about the upcoming training. Despite the noise around him, Albert's focus remained unshaken, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Crater and his group. The Titanian was clearly attempting to provoke him, but Albert remained unfazed, not allowing himself to be distracted. When it was finally his turn, Albert stepped up to the desk. The insectoid officer clicked its mandibles in greeting before switching to the common galactic tongue. "Name and designation," the officer asked in a sharp, clicking voice. "Captain Albert Hicks, United Nations Space Force, Earth," Albert replied with a composed tone. The officer's many eyes studied him for a moment before inputting the information into a holographic interface. "Room 17B. Training orientation starts at 0600 hours. Your team assignment will be announced at the briefing next," the officer said. Albert nodded, accepting the orientation materials and stepping aside. He moved toward the barracks, ready to begin his training, the laughter of Crater and his group fading behind him as he focused on the challenges ahead. The dormitory complex was a blend of utilitarian design and alien aesthetics, with walls that shifted colors according to the time of day and climate regulators that adjusted to accommodate the varied physiological needs of the inhabitants. The corridors buzzed with activity as recruits unpacked and settled into their new quarters. Albert swiftly located his assigned room, stepping inside to find the modest furnishings typical of such facilities: a single bunk, a storage compartment, and a holographic display console for accessing schedules and messages. As he unpacked, his movements were deliberate and efficient, his mind already focusing on the trials that lay ahead. However, the stillness was quickly broken. A booming voice reverberated through the hallway, accompanied by the heavy thud of footsteps. "Where's the human? I want to see the so-called warrior up close." Albert immediately recognized the voice of Crater, the Titanian, even before the massive figure appeared at the door. Moments later, Crater entered, flanked by 2 of his companions. Their imposing presence filled the hallway, making it feel unnervingly narrow. Crater leaned casually against the doorway, his stone-like skin shimmering under the lights. "So, you're the human they sent," Crater said, his tone laced with ridicule. "I hope you brought more than just your little muscles. This isn't a low-gravity playground where you can fake it." Albert didn't flinch as he turned to face him. His response was cool, controlled. "Is there something you need?" Crater paused, momentarily taken aback by Albert's calmness. He had expected a more typical response: anger, defensiveness, but Albert's composed demeanor only seemed seem to provoke him further. "I'm just trying to figure out why they'd bother sending your kind here," Crater continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "We'll be lifting heavy loads and fighting on the front lines. What are you going to do? Fill out reports?" The other Titanian recruits chuckled, their laughter reverberating down the hall. Albert stood his ground, maintaining his stoic silence. "If you're done, I need to prepare for tomorrow's briefing," he said, turning back to his packing. Crater's smile faded, and irritation flickered in his eyes. He wasn't used to being ignored, and Albert's lack of reaction only intensified his desire to assert dominance. "Don't think you can hide behind that calm attitude forever," Crater growled. "When the time comes, we'll see what you're made of." With that, Crater turned and stalked off, his companions following closely behind. As their footsteps echoed into the distance, Albert let out a quiet breath, the corners of his mouth twitching in a faint smirk. The confrontation had unfolded exactly as he expected, predictable, almost laughably so. Albert knew that soon enough, his actions would speak louder than any words could. The next morning, the air around the Galactic Defense Academy was charged with the weight of anticipation. Recruits gathered in the expansive outdoor training arena, surrounded by shimmering energy shields that kept the area secure. Alien cadets of all shapes, sizes, and species prepared for the day's activities, stretching, adjusting gear, and whispering among themselves. Amid the chaotic yet disciplined crowd stood Captain Albert Hicks. His calm, focused presence contrasted sharply with the lively buzz around him as he took in the surroundings with a sharp, analytical gaze. Across the arena, Crater stood out like a colossal rock among smaller pebbles. The Titanian's immense stature and confident bearing drew the attention of those nearby. Despite the diversity of the gathered recruits, it was clear that the Titanian's physicality demanded respect, but Albert's steady observation showed no sign of intimidation. The real test had yet to come. Crater's deep, rumbling laughter echoed across the field as he spoke animatedly with his companions, clearly enjoying the attention he had garnered after his earlier encounter with Albert. The recruits were quickly called into formation, their movements precise and orderly as Commander Rex, a reptilian figure with a sharply angular face and a tail that swayed with commanding authority, made his entrance. Rex's piercing yellow eyes swept over the crowd, demanding complete silence as he prepared to speak. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Academy." Rex's voice rang out, amplified by a holographic projection, his tone sharp and commanding. "You are here because you represent the best your worlds have to offer, but let me make something clear, none of that matters. Titles, reputations, physical traits, none of it will shield you from what lies ahead. Only your actions and your resilience will determine your worth here." The weight of the commander's words settled over the recruits like a challenge, stirring a quiet approval in Albert. This was a place where results spoke louder than empty accolades, and Albert was well suited to thrive in such a merit-driven environment. Yet, the momentary calm was soon disrupted by a low, mocking voice from the Titanian group. "Actions, huh?" Crater sneered, loud enough for several nearby recruits to hear. "Let's see what actions the humans can muster." His companions chuckled, and a few of the other recruits glanced toward Albert, waiting for his response. Albert, however, remained unmoved. His focus was solely on the commander, disregarding Crater's taunts as irrelevant. The day's training began with a series of grueling tests designed to evaluate the recruits' physical and mental prowess. The first challenge involved navigating a series of holographic obstacle courses, followed by solving complex tactical puzzles under strict time limits. Albert approached each test with calm precision, applying strategy and adaptability to make up for any physical shortcomings. His approach wasn't flashy, but it was effective, earning the silent admiration of a few observant recruits. Crater, on the other hand, was a natural in the physical trials. His immense strength and stamina made him a dominant force in challenges requiring raw power. He effortlessly lifted massive weights, shattered through simulated barriers, and led his team to victory in a grueling tug-of-war exercise. With every display of his physical superiority, Crater wore a smug grin, clearly pleased with himself. But as the day wore on, his attention inevitably turned back to Albert. Later, the recruits were escorted to a section of the arena where various pieces of heavy military equipment were lined up, ready for the next challenge. The commander outlined the exercise, moving the equipment from one end of the arena to the other within a set time limit. It was a task that would require cooperation, strength, and careful coordination, as some pieces were far too heavy for any single recruit to lift alone. Crater saw an opportunity to escalate things and issued a challenge that was impossible to ignore. "Let's make this more interesting," he called out, his voice booming over the arena's hum of activity. "Let's see if the human can handle this on his own." All eyes turned to Albert, who remained standing still, unfazed by the sudden spotlight. Crater smirked as he pointed pointed to the largest piece of equipment in the lineup, a gravity regulator unit weighing over 3 tons. The massive device resembled a cubical structure with glowing panels and intricate wiring, clearly built for heavy-duty operations. "Go on, Earthling," Crater taunted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see what you've got." The commander's eyes flicked briefly between Albert and Crater, but he made no move to intervene, allowing the situation to unfold without interference. Albert's gaze remained steady, unfazed by the Titanian's challenge. The tension in the air grew thicker, and the recruits watched with bated breath to see how the human would respond to the confrontation. This was, after all, a place where one could prove their worth, and Commander Rex seemed content to let the recruits settle their differences within the boundaries of the training exercises. Albert stepped forward, his every movement exuding quiet confidence. "I'll give it a try," he said, his tone neutral and without bravado. The simplicity of his words caught the crowd off guard, drawing a few skeptical chuckles, but also piquing their curiosity. Crater, arms crossed and his stone-like skin gleaming under the artificial sunlight, sneered. "Ready to enjoy this?" he muttered, his voice thick with disdain. Albert approached the gravity regulator, sizing it up carefully. He didn't rush or show frustration, but instead methodically circled the massive device to study its structure and weight distribution. Where others might have seen an opportunity to show off brute strength, Albert viewed the task as a puzzle, one that required the right combination of strategy, leverage, and technique. As he placed his hands on the edges of the heavy machine, the arena fell into a hushed silence. Even Crater, who had expected a quick failure, stood frozen, momentarily captivated by Albert's measured movements. Albert adjusted his posture and grip, his knees bending slightly, before taking a deep breath and attempting the lift. The first try was met with resistance, the gravity regulator's weight pressing down like an immovable force. Albert didn't falter. Instead, he reset his stance and tried again, shifting his angle. A faint creaking sound reverberated as the device shifted slightly, and the crowd leaned forward, drawn into the moment. By the third attempt, Albert found the balance point. Using the design of the machine to create leverage, he summoned all his strength to lift. With a surge of effort, the human slowly raised the regulator off the ground, his compact frame straining under the 3-ton weight. There was a brief stumble as Albert adjusted, but then, with steady determination, he stabilized. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Albert began moving, each step taken carefully, the immense weight supported by his strength and willpower. Sweat glistened on his brow, but there was no doubt in his eyes, his focus unwavering. The scene was surreal. It was a testament to human ingenuity, to the ability to overcome odds with determination and cleverness. Crater's expression darkened as it became clear this wasn't the failure he had expected. Albert had turned the challenge into a quiet victory, one that shattered the assumptions held by many. By the time Albert carefully set the gravity regulator down at the designated spot, the arena was eerily quiet. The weight of his accomplishment hung in the air, leaving even the most skeptical recruits in stunned silence. Albert straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. He turned to face Crater, meeting the Titanian's gaze. There was no smugness in his expression, no need for gloating, just a calm acknowledgement of the feat. Crater, for the first time, was left speechless. The mockery had faded, replaced by something akin to respect. The exercise resumed, but the atmosphere in the arena had shifted. Albert's actions had spoken louder than any words could. Though Crater remained outwardly stoic, the seed of doubt had been planted. The rivalry between them was far from over, but the dynamics had changed. Later that evening, Albert's dormitory was quiet, the stillness a stark contrast to the earlier tension in the arena. The victory of carrying the gravity regulator had sent ripples through the academy, with recruits murmuring about the human who had defied expectations. For Albert, however, it was just another day, one in a long series of challenges, each one shaping him further into the soldier he had always strived to be. Albert had no interest in theatrics or proving himself to others. His focus was straightforward: adapt, survive, and excel. Yet, the growing attention from the academy's recruits wasn't something he could ignore, especially with the mix of admiration and skepticism that came with it. As the door to his dormitory slid shut with a soft hiss, Albert sat down on the edge of his bunk. He reviewed the schedule for the next day's training on the holographic console. The upcoming exercises were daunting: endurance drills, survival simulations, and advanced tactical scenarios, all designed to test the limits of the recruits. Albert's mind sharpened as he processed the challenges ahead. Preparation was paramount. Physical strength alone wouldn't be enough to succeed here. What the academy truly demanded was strategy and adaptability, traits humanity had always relied on to thrive across the galaxy. Elsewhere in the academy, Crater was stewing in frustration. His quarters, larger than Albert's, had been designed to accommodate his colossal frame. But the spaciousness felt suffocating, weighed down by the bitterness of defeat. His companions, who had once laughed at Albert, now circled cautiously, unsure how to engage with the Titanian's simmering anger. "No one embarrasses me like that," Crater muttered under his breath. His pride had taken a hit, and the memory of Albert's unexpected success gnawed at him. While Albert spent his evening honing his techniques and mentally preparing, Crater was plotting. The human's triumph wasn't something that could go unchallenged. Crater needed to reassert his dominance, not only to restore his ego but to remind everyone why Titanians were considered the premier warriors of the galaxy. Albert's success, he decided, was a fluke, could be undone, crushed with the right strategy. Crater had learned that brute strength wasn't always the answer, but with the right approach, he could turn the tables. The warning came as the Academy basked in the golden light of Rallus 7's twin suns. Recruits gathered in the central courtyard, their chatter punctuated by the hum of hovering training drones. Albert arrived early, as was his habit, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. While his presence was understated, it commanded attention. Conversations faltered as Albert passed through the courtyard, recruits instinctively parting to make way. His performance the previous day had left a lasting impression. Crater was already there, his towering figure casting a shadow over a group of fellow Titanians. When their eyes met, Crater smirked, his confidence seemingly restored. Today offered him another chance to prove himself, and he was determined not to fail. Commander Rex arrived shortly thereafter, his sharp gaze cutting through the crowd. "Today's training will test your endurance, problem-solving abilities, and teamwork," he announced. "You will be divided into teams and tasked with navigating a simulated combat scenario. Your objective: retrieve a beacon from the center of the arena and return it to your base, all while facing a series of obstacles." The recruits exchanged glances, silently assessing potential teammates. The simulation was designed to mimic real combat conditions, environmental hazards, enemy drones, and limited resources. It wasn't about raw strength, it would test coordination, quick thinking, and trust. As expected, Crater immediately took command of his team. His booming voice left no room for dissent as he assigned roles and devised a strategy. He was intent on dominating the exercise, and his teammates, eager to capitalize on his reputation, followed his lead without question. Albert, however, found himself assigned to a diverse team of recruits from various species, none of whom were particularly familiar with each other. As the recruits began forming into their teams, Albert's calm demeanor remained, his mind already analyzing how best to approach the challenge. This was a test of more than just physical strength. It was about teamwork, communication, and leveraging each individual's unique strengths. He was ready to prove once again that humans, though underestimated, could excel when it mattered most. Albert's team was an eclectic mix of strengths and weaknesses. There was an amphibian navigator, whose sharp instincts guided their path, a small, agile insectoid technician, whose nimbleness proved invaluable in tight situations, and a quiet humanoid sniper, whose keen eyesight made them a perfect asset in taking out threats from a distance. Unlike Crater's team, there was no clear leader among Albert's group. However, Albert naturally stepped into the role, not through force but through quiet competence. His suggestions were measured, and his calm demeanor quickly earned the trust of his teammates. As the simulation began, the arena morphed into a sprawling maze, full of rugged terrain, towering obstacles, and hostile drones. Recruits scattered in every direction, each team charting their own path toward the beacon located at the center. Crater's group, relying on brute force, smashed through obstacles and overwhelmed any resistance in their way. Their progress was fast but chaotic, leaving a trail of destruction that drew the attention of the drones. Alarms blared as automated defenses zeroed in on their location, slowing them down and forcing them to divert their attention to defense rather than strategy. Albert's team, by contrast, moved with quiet precision. They avoided unnecessary confrontations, using the insectoid's agility to scout ahead and the amphibian navigator's sharp instincts to find hidden paths. When drones appeared, the sniper took them out with surgical accuracy, conserving their energy and minimizing the risks of detection. Albert expertly coordinated their movements, leveraging each individual's strengths and maintaining focus on their shared goal. The beacon was located in the heart of the arena, heavily guarded by a series of sophisticated defenses. Crater's team reached it first, but their approach, focused on raw power, was ill-suited for the task. The beacon was embedded in a pedestal surrounded by a complex locking mechanism, requiring precision to disengage. Crater's strength, so effective in clearing obstacles, was of little use here. Frustration mounted as they struggled to unlock the mechanism, each failed attempt triggering more drones. They found themselves fighting a two-front battle, defending against the drones while trying to figure out the lock. Albert's team, meanwhile, had arrived unnoticed. They observed the chaos from a distance, assessing the situation. Albert quickly devised a plan. While the sniper provided cover, Albert and the insectoid technician moved toward the beacon. Under the cover of shadows, and using the insectoid's dexterity and Albert's mechanical knowledge, they began working on the lock with a steady, focused approach. Crater spotted them too late. "They're stealing our beacon," he roared, charging toward them with his team in tow. But Albert and the insectoid had already completed their task. The beacon was freed, and the team began their retreat, moving with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The final stretch of the simulation became a race against time. Crater's group, desperate and frustrated, tried to catch up. Their earlier recklessness had caught up with them. Injuries, depleted resources, and a disorganized approach left them vulnerable. Albert's team, however, remained composed. They coordinated seamlessly, using their skills to evade pursuit and cover each other's weaknesses. As they crossed the finish line with the beacon in hand, their victory was clear. As the simulation ended, recruits gathered in the arena, their exhaustion written on their faces, but overshadowed by the rush of adrenaline. Crater approached Albert, his expression a mix of anger and grudging respect. "You got lucky," he muttered, though the venom had faded from his tone. Albert simply nodded in acknowledgement, offering no rebuttal. The results spoke for themselves. No words were needed. The lesson had been made clear: brute strength alone was insufficient. True warriors were defined not just by their power, but by their adaptability, intelligence, and ability to work as a team. Albert had demonstrated that leadership and strategy could turn a disparate group into a cohesive unit, securing victory through brains rather than brawn. The days following the simulation brought a marked shift in the atmosphere at the academy. Albert's unexpected victory became the talk of the recruits, not just because they had won, but because of how they had done it. The quiet human, who had once gone largely unnoticed, now carried an undeniable air of respect. His calm, strategic approach had earned him admiration, and the whispers of his success spread quickly. However, for Albert, his routine remained unchanged. Each day began early, filled with drills, strategy sessions, and problem-solving exercises. Success wasn't a destination, it was an ongoing process, one built on consistency, adaptability, and the willingness to keep improving. For Crater, however, the sting of defeat lingered like an unshakable shadow. His pride had been wounded twice, first in the lifting challenge, and then in the simulation, where his raw strength had been outclassed by Albert's tactical thinking. Once considered the unchallenged alpha among the recruits, Crater now found his position under scrutiny. While there was no open disrespect, few were bold enough to challenge him directly. The whispered comments and sidelong glances made it clear that the recruits were no longer certain of his invincibility. Determined to reclaim his dominance, Crater threw himself into training with a newfound intensity. His massive frame moved through the academy's facilities like a relentless machine. He had convinced himself that if his strength hadn't been enough before, it was only because he hadn't pushed himself hard enough. He doubled down on his efforts, throwing every ounce of energy into proving his superiority. But with every passing day, Crater's frustration deepened. He realized that brute force alone wasn't enough to best Albert. To defeat the human, Crater would have to outthink and outlast him. This realization gnawed at his ego, and the more he trained, the more he knew that he couldn't simply overpower Albert. He would need a different strategy. The opportunity for a decisive confrontation came during a morning briefing in the Academy's main hall. Commander Rex, standing tall on the raised platform, outlined the next challenge. This time, the recruits would face a test of strength, endurance, and sheer willpower. They were tasked with transporting a series of heavy equipment pieces from one end of the arena to the other. The equipment varied in size and complexity, and each recruit would need to complete the task alone. No teams, no assistance, just raw determination and ingenuity. The announcement was met with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The Academy's trials were notorious for their difficulty, and this one was expected to push the recruits to their limits. For Albert, it was just another challenge in the ongoing process of proving adaptability and resilience. But for Crater, it was the perfect opportunity to reassert his dominance. If he could succeed in this task, particularly with the largest piece of equipment, the monstrous 5-ton command unit, he would silence any lingering doubts about his superiority. The command unit stood apart from the others. Its immense size and complexity made it more of a monument than a piece of equipment meant for transport. No recruit in the Academy's history had ever attempted to move it. During this trial, it was meant as a psychological barrier, a reminder of the recruits' limitations. After the briefing concluded, the recruits were given a simple directive: move as many pieces as possible within the allotted time. As they made their way to the arena, they surveyed the rows of heavy machinery laid out before them. From massive gravity regulators to intricate weapon platforms, the equipment ranged ranged from manageable to nearly impossible to move. Each piece was clearly labeled with its weight and the skill level required. Crater, however, focused only on the command unit. If he could move that massive piece of machinery, it would reaffirm his dominance, ensuring that no one, especially Albert, would ever question his place again. His eyes burned with determination as the trial began. Some recruits opted for smaller, more manageable pieces, choosing speed and efficiency over brute strength. Others took on heavier loads in an attempt to maximize their scores, though not all could handle the weight. Albert approached the task methodically, selecting pieces that balanced weight with complexity. His focus was sharp, as he carefully considered the best use of his energy and time. Crater, however, had a different approach in mind. He aimed for the largest, most challenging piece, determined to show that no task was beyond him. The arena was filled with the sounds of grunts and exertion as the recruits struggled with their loads, but Crater moved with single-minded purpose toward his goal, while Albert kept a more calculated pace, moving deliberately from task to task. Both were determined, but for very different reasons. Albert's movements were deliberate, conserving energy and focusing on technique. While others strained under the sheer weight of their loads, Albert used leverage and balance to offset his physical limitations. His approach was calculated, always mindful of every step, ensuring that no movement was wasted. Crater, on the other hand, moved with unyielding determination. He started with smaller pieces, building momentum, his massive frame making even the heaviest tasks seem effortless. But his eyes never left the command unit, the ultimate prize. When the halfway mark was announced, Crater made his move. The arena fell silent as he approached the colossal structure. His intentions were clear, and his teammates watched with a mix of awe and apprehension. Even for a Titanian, this was an almost insurmountable task. Crater squared his shoulders, his muscles bulging as he gripped the edges of the unit. With a deep, guttural growl, he began to lift, his strength causing the ground beneath him to tremble. Slowly, inch by inch, the command unit rose. The cheers of his companions filled the air as their faith in him was renewed. But the task was far from over. Every movement was a struggle, as the sheer weight of the unit made every step a battle. Crater's breaths grew heavier, labored, and his massive frame trembled under the strain. His pride pushed him further, but with each passing second, exhaustion began to show. His steps slowed, his grip faltered, and the massive unit wavered dangerously. Albert, watching from a distance, remained focused on his own task. His gaze wasn't on Crater's struggle, but on the next task at hand. His focus was steady, unaffected by the chaos around him. Albert moved toward the final piece on his list, a smaller, more intricate energy core that required precision to handle. With steady hands, Albert secured the core and began his journey across the arena. As Albert moved, the arena erupted in commotion. Crater, exhausted and pushed to his limits, collapsed under the weight of the command unit. The massive structure crashed to the ground with a deafening impact, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Medics rushed to Crater's side, their faces a mixture of concern and frustration. Despite the fall, Crater was unharmed, but his pride was shattered. When the trial concluded, the recruits gathered to hear the results. Albert's name was announced among the top performers, his methodical approach earning him the respect of those who had doubted him. Crater, once the undisputed powerhouse of the group, was noticeably absent from the leaderboard. The contrast between them was stark. One had relied solely on strength, while the other had balanced strength with strategy and resilience. As the crowd began to disperse, Crater approached Albert. His expression was unreadable, a mix of lingering resentment and reluctant admiration. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. Then, to Albert's surprise, Crater extended his hand. "You earned it," Crater said, his voice low but steady. "The victory, the respect. You earned it." Albert studied Crater's face, noting the sincerity in his words. After a brief pause, he shook the Titanian's hand. "So did you," Albert replied, his voice calm. "You just don't see it yet." The exchange, though brief, marked a turning point. The rivalry that had once defined their interactions began to dissolve, replaced by a mutual understanding and respect. Crater's pride remained intact, but it was tempered by a newfound humility. Albert, pragmatic as ever, recognized the potential for camaraderie in their shared pursuit of excellence. In the weeks that followed, their dynamic evolved. While competition still marked their interactions, it was no longer fueled by animosity. Instead, it became a driving force that pushed both of them to improve. Crater began to incorporate more strategy into his training, adopting some of Albert's methods. Albert, in turn, found value in Crater's relentless drive and raw power. By the time the Academy's final trials approached, Albert and Crater had forged a bond rooted in mutual respect. They stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their journey had tested their limits, reshaped their perceptions, and redefined what it meant to be strong. In the end, it wasn't about victory or dominance. It was about growth, learning from failures, building on successes, and finding strength in unity. Under the stars of Vertalis 7, Albert and Crater stood as living proof that even the most unlikely rivals could become allies in the pursuit of greatness.